All right. Now, so here's the, so we saw yesterday that the shutfis, according to Rav Moshe, besides not being a mitzvah of tzedakah, but it's a real business partnership. And you don't have the ability to just give him a salary in your company. You have to make him a full 50% partner. And it has to be something that you would have done even if this guy was not your son-in-law or something like that. Okay, the last thing that we're going to see here is Gam Elu Shiyastu Yeshiva Utzrichim Lazar Lahatalmidim B'Matzavam Hagashmi. He says, those who establish yeshivot, and they need to help their students in their financial affairs. And they're taking large donations from various individuals. He says they do have a right to tell their donors that when they donate a certain fixed amount, let's say if you give $50,000 a year to the yeshiva, you will be supporting one of our avreichim, you'll be supporting one of our guys in Kollel. He says, and you will be entitled to half, 50% of his schar for that the student will get when he studies in our yeshiva. However, you can only do so by first asking permission from the student. Because how could you give something to someone else that belongs? You're taking the student's reward for Torah study. How can you take away someone else's reward for Torah study and give it to someone else without their permission? So therefore, there has to be a consultation with the student, with the guy learning in Kollel. Do you agree to give up half of your reward for Torah study in exchange for getting supported by this balabayas? Now, what's problematic is that Rav Moshe seems to be contradicting himself. Previously, he had said that if this is going to be a Yisachar Zvulun relationship, it is a business partnership where people divide the business 50-50 and they divide the Torah study 50-50. And here apparently he's allowing, he did equivocate on that point. Let me just bring it back up. He says in point number Dalet, that Udavka Shava B'Shava, below Tolo Kefishi Yisratza. He says, but it could be that there's wiggle room, because apparently a yeshiva is allowed to tell people that for $50,000 you get half of an Avreich's Torah study. Avol nira lanius daiti, the lo shaykh ze belimudim shekol echad ve'echad muchach lilmod v'leida ze ba'atzmo. He says, however, you can't offer that kind of deal to your donors if the students are learning in the yeshiva where they're obligated to learn these materials anyway. Lo rak limudei haktani mamash, and therefore it certainly doesn't apply to small children. You can't go over to a donor and say, this little kid in third grade who's learning Chumash will give you half of his reward for his Torah study if you support him over the course of the year. He says, Ela'af elu shalomdim kvar. I'm not sure what this abbreviation stands for. Gimel Pa'amim Torah. I'm not sure what that stands for. Even people, or maybe Gufei Torah. I'm not sure what the abbreviation stands for. Even people who are studying more advanced Torah subjects, Sheharei Gam B'nei Zvulun Tzrichim Lilmod Zeh Ba'atzman, because the Zvulun supporters have to study those basics themselves. V'rak limud kol haTorah lihitamek bo lichakem biyoter Shezei ef shalaruba deruba de inshi shachar dor hamidbar. He says it's only for the more advanced Torah studies, for someone who truly wishes to deepen his wisdom in Torah knowledge, like a person is going to be studying Kollel. That's not possible for most people to do after the generation of the desert, mishum shehutzruchu lamol harbe leparnasasim, because they had to work hard for their parnasa. Ela al yedei shnayim kizvulin v'yisachar, and that's why the whole system was set up to begin with the acknowledgement that once we get into Eretz Yisrael and we have to start working the land, it's not going to be practical for most people to be able to deepen their Torah wisdom to the point where they become the next generation of rabbinic leaders. And that's why the whole Zavulun Yisachar relationship was set up in the first place, was to enable two people to work on molding and producing a great Torah scholar. Sometimes one person can't do it on his own, because where's his parnasa going to come from? And so therefore, by having Yisachar and Zvulun combined together, that was the whole objective, was between the two of us, we'll build a Torah scholar together. She'echad mehem yasuk b'chol inyani haparnasa kizvulun, ve'echad mehem yasuk rak b'Torah kol yamav ki Yisachar. One of them will be engaged in business matters and won't be focusing on deepening his wisdom, but he'll be contributing to the other, who will be deepening his wisdom but won't be focusing on physical sustenance. Shimkein nimtza mostos hakololim bizmanenu shalomdim shamavrechem b'nei Torah liskadu lischakeim yicholim la'asos kein, and therefore a kollel is allowed to do that. And similarly, yeshivot that appeal to, let's say, adult young men can do that as well. He says, however, if you've got students who are young enough, who are still living at home with their parents, and they are being supported by their parents, and therefore they don't rely on the yeshiva to support them, then the yeshiva should not be offering this offer to their donors, and they should not be asking the students to give up a portion of their Torah study because the kids are being supported by their parents. The yeshiva has to cover expenses for all the kids that are on scholarship, but the kids are still getting their basic needs met by their parents. Yedido Mokiro Ma'od Moshe Feinstein. So that really puts everything to rest. So Rav Moshe raised 9 points. Point number one is that it's not a mitzvah of tzedakah, it's a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, for two people to produce a Talmud Chacham, a true Talmud Chacham. It's number two, it is unique because normally when a mitzvah is incumbent upon an individual, like putting on tefillin, I can't get rewarded for enabling someone else to put on tefillin as if I put on tefillin myself. I'm doing a chesed, I'm enabling another person to do a mitzvah, I get a separate reward for that, but I don't get the reward for putting on the tefillin myself. Talmud Torah is different. And the point number three, that there has to be a contract either drawn up or orally consummated between the two parties in advance. Point number four is that it has to be a 50-50 relationship. He says anything less is in some way a deprecation of the Torah study that Yisachar is going to engage in. Number five, if it is a true partnership, Yisachar has to be prepared to take a loss when Zevulun does not have a successful year. Point number six is that the two people who choose to enter into a Zevulun Yisachar relationship, Yisachar has to do his due diligence to make sure that Zevulun is going to follow through and is not going to leave him hanging and tense and nervous about where his next meal is going to come from, because otherwise then Zevulun doesn't get the reward at all if Yisachar is constantly worried and preoccupied about how he's going to make his parnasa. Number 7, related to that, is that the Yisachar Zvulun relationship has to be for a duration of time such that Yisachar will be indeed able to deepen his wisdom. So Rav Moshe had suggested that it's not less than 3 years. But he said there are times when you can get by with even 1 year. So he equivocated a little bit on that. And then point number 8, you can only do this partnership with someone who would do it even for a stranger. It can't be that he's entering into the Yisachar Zvulun relationship because he needs to take care of his son-in-law who doesn't have any trade experience, doesn't have a profession, and that's the only reason why he's doing it. That doesn't count as a Yisachar Zvulun relationship. It may count as tzedakah, but it's not a Yisachar Zvulun relationship. And then finally, Rav Moshe says a yeshiva does have a right to arrange this for its donors. However, they have to get permission from the members of their kollel first before they start offering to give away half of their reward for Torah study. Okay, so. Yeah.
That's not really seriously focused on like the share of profits and contracts.
Correct. Correct. So I don't know. I don't understand why Rav Moshe finally relented in this last item. It could be just because, even though this is not the optimal Yisachar Zvulun relationship, because it does reflect a deprecation of the Torah, because $50,000 for a wealthy person may not be a substantial amount of money, but nonetheless, the yeshiva has a right to offer it. Okay. Okay. So that concludes our discussion of this tshuva. And I guess what we should do is we should commence with our study of Hilchos Tzedakah. So let us get back to that. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. But it does. That's the whole definition of Yisachar Zvulun relationship, is that it does detract. Sorry. Something has gone awry. Give me 1 second. I have to pull this up, pull it up. So. My computer is not cooperating. Okay. So. For some reason. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Here we are. Okay. So we were talking about pledges, okay? Yeah, I'm going to share the screen. This is really weird. Okay. Okay, so the last thing what we saw is that Misha Hotzi Mipiv Neder Latet Tzedakah La'aniyim. He says if a person took a neder to give charity to the poor, Lo Mo'ila Le'inyan Zeh Mesiras Hamodah Shenagu Lasos Be'erev Rosh Hashanah Mekevin Shahotzi Neder Mipiv. It's not enough to give a notification to the Dayanim on Erev Rosh Hashanah to try to get a Hataras Nadarim. That you can't get a Hataras Nadarim for a tzedakah pledge because you made a verbal pledge. Okay. Ve'im ha'aniyim mitzuyim chayv laseis lahem miyad. And if there are poor people present, you made a pledge to give, let's say, $1,000 to the poor, you have to fulfill that immediately. You can't say, well, I'll do it later. Over al bal ta'acher. And if you know that there's a poor person that you pledge to give tzedakah to, you know that he needs the money, and you neglect to give it to him, and you delay, you violate the Torah commandment of lo sa'acher l'shalamo. You're not allowed to delay fulfilling your pledge for charity. But if you're not aware, let's say I made a pledge, I'm going to give $1,000 to the poor, but you don't know of anyone who's poor right now, you're not obligated to try and do some kind of research to track down poor people. You can say, when a poor person presents himself to me, I will give him the money. V'yesh mi sha'omer, sha'over al bal ta'acher im lo chipes acharehem u'vintayim avru gimel regalim. There is an opinion that says that if you made a pledge to tzedakah and you didn't bother looking around for poor people, and in the interim, 3 of the shalosh regalim have elapsed, Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuos, right? Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot. So then you are in violation. V'lachein tov lahasno shekol ma'aser sheyafrish lo yachol olav shem tzedakah ad sheyav liyad ha'ani kidei shebechol ofen lo yav lidei iser bal ta'acher al hanasina. And therefore, what's preferable to do is, like we said, a lot of people, once they get their paycheck or their, whatever dividends they were expecting, they put aside money for the poor. But you should not designate it as tzedakah money for the poor. You should say, I only want it to turn into tzedakah money once it reaches the hands of the recipient, right? And that way you won't be violating bal ta'acher. Because let's say you put aside money at the beginning of the year and you're not going to be giving it until the end of the year. So, because you want to be able to see how much you've accumulated and how you're going to divide your tzedakah money. But in the meantime, there are many poor people who may present themselves over the course of the year. And you want not to be able to feel guilty that you haven't helped those people, even though you have tzedakah money available. And therefore, you have to, it's preferable to sort of put aside the money, but have it not count as tzedakah until it actually gets into their hands. Okay, bizmanenu, in our times, sheyesh tamir aniyim, im nadar lasei tzedakah la'aniyim, chayiv lahafrish et sikum hatruma u'lesito lahem miyad. So nowadays, And in other words, it's interesting to note, like at what point does a pledge become payable? That's something that we had started talking about. And what comes out from the poskim is that once the charity to whom you have pledged expresses a need, then you are obligated to give it to them. Whereas let's say the charity says, okay, you had pledged to some kind of building fund. Okay, we're ready to hire the architects. We need your pledge to be able to hire the architects. You don't have a right to say, well, I'll give you the money when you start digging the foundation, right? Well, no, that was never that was never the deal. In other words, the deal is that once you make a pledge for tzedakah, it becomes payable as soon as the ani expresses a need for that money. So if a charity expresses a need for that money to begin its project that you had pledged for, that pledge becomes payable immediately. Bismanenu, sheyesh tamid aniyim. So nowadays that there are always poor prevalent in every community, once you make a generic pledge to give money to the poor, chayiv lahafrish et sikum hatruma l'sita lahem miyad, then you're obligated to take that money out of your regular fund and to give it to the poor immediately. You don't have a right to delay. Okay, next.
Rabbi. Okay.
Yeah, it has to be during that year if there was no specific project. But let's say you say, I'm going to give it to the poor, and a poor person comes to you and says, I need money. So you can't say, well, I'm deciding that I'm not giving it to you. So it's always a good idea when you say set aside money, don't designate it as tzedakah funds. You say this will become in the future tzedakah funds. Ron, did you have something you wanted to say?
I have a sort of question, a little bit off topic, but it relates to this maybe a little bit. Let's say there's two sons, there's one parent left, and then they leave it in the will. Let's say leaves $1 million to two sons, so it's 500,000 each, and then chop off 50,000 that he's putting aside for his meiser money. It's $50,000 he's putting aside now for that. Is there a time limit when he has that now, that $50,000 that he has to dole it out, or can he leave it in an account, his stuck account, and just at his own will? Is there a time limit of a certain time?
Why did you start the scenario with as an inheritance? Is that a crucial part of the question?
Yeah, I'm just saying he came into some money like that.
In other words, a guy comes into money. It doesn't really matter how he came into money.
No, it doesn't matter.
It could have been a gift. It could have been a tax. What's it called? The tax rebate. He came into money, right? And he has now $500,000, and he takes off 50,000 for tzedakah, and he puts it in a segregated account. So your question is, does he have to give that money right away, or can he be discriminating about it? So that's the reason why we said that it's always best to not designate that money as tzedakah. You should say that this money is designated as being future tzedakah. But it's not tzedakah money right now. Because once you designate something as tzedakah money right now, then as soon as someone who is in need comes to you, you have an obligation to give it to them. So if you want to be able to avoid that, you do have a right to, first of all, you do have a right, once a poor person comes to you, you have to give them something. Like we learned before, you can be discriminating in the amount that you wish to give them. But if you'd like to avoid that whole problem, the best thing to do is to say that this money is currently not tzedakah money, but in the future will be converted into tzedakah money, and therefore there's no expiration date on how and when you distribute that money. Okay, but obviously, if you're doing tithing on an annual basis, then you should make sure that it's within the year of when you receive that cash, because otherwise, then you haven't tithed if you haven't designated it as tzedakah money. Okay. All right. I think we'll hold it here for today. It's already at the clock. So let me wish you all a good Shabbos, and we'll see you Mirz Hashem on Monday.